The views expressed on this program are those of the producers and individuals appearing on this program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Sun Prairie Media Center staff, its video service providers, or the staff and elected officials of the City of Sun Prairie.
Hey everyone, this is Rose Daly, the City Sustainability Coordinator of Sun Prairie, and you're listening to the Sustainable Sun Prairie Podcast, the show that aspires to educate, empower, and engage our listeners in all aspects of sustainability. Whether you are a seasoned sustainability enthusiast or just beginning your sustainability journey, each episode will have something new and exciting for everyone. Let's begin the conversation for a greener community. Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode where we're taking a deep dive into some of the most promising renewable energy sources and exploring their potential to power our nation. We're also going to explore what it takes to establish a large-scale solar farm and discuss whether or not fossil fuels can be completely phased out. We'll end our discussion today by touching on how the new federal administration is impacting the clean energy future of our country. Now, joining me today is a special guest who specializes in energy law. Welcome, Michael. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you, Rose. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, how are things going today?
They're going well. It's sunny outside, which is great for solar, and as well as my mood, and I'm ready to go.
Love that. Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Michael Allen, and I am a renewable energy attorney. And these days, pretty much 100% of my time is spent working on developing renewable energy projects. Sun Prairie has a special place in my heart. I lived here for 25 years, and it really was a special and important time in my life and development. I represented the city for about 8 years as its legal counsel and 5 as the official Sun Prairie City Attorney. I'm working currently at a law firm by the name of Macaulay Lyman. I have, through the course of my career, had several different places for doing my work, big law firms, a mid-sized law firm in Madison, and as it relates to Sun Prairie, for nearly 20 years, I had a solo law practice, Energy Law Wisconsin, which is really where I grew my renewable energy business, and I was on Main Street, right across from Culver's, for nearly 20 years. So that's my background. As far as the type of work I've done over the years, I've worked both on renewable energy and fossil fuel energy projects. I've also done a lot of work with energy efficiency, working on behalf of private colleges in Wisconsin, school districts, utilities, solar installers, all kinds of people. So anyway, we can get to that later. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, we're excited to have you here today. I was actually curious. So I know you mentioned that you have worked in both the fossil fuel space as well as the renewable space, and I find that very interesting. Could you share what prompted you to shift your focus away from fossil fuels and onto renewables?
Sure. Yeah, it was really a matter of the circumstances of the time. And what I mean by that is about 25 years ago, even 30 years ago, there was a real concern about there being a shortage of power in Wisconsin. And there were prospects of blackouts and things like that. So there was a big move at that point to build more generation. And at the time, the type of generation that was being built was fossil fuel. So there was a new large coal plant built in southeastern Wisconsin. The University of Wisconsin and Madison Gas and Electric Company co-owned a natural gas fueled, they call it a cogeneration plant. It not only produced electricity, but also steam and chilled water to serve the university. So that was where things started, but over time, renewables became more of the mix. And I started with some small, mid-sized solar and wind projects, but over time those grew. The costs of solar and wind have dropped considerably. They're part of the mainstream renewable energy mix, and I was also passionate about it. My decision to come here and set up my own practice where I got to choose who I represented was really driven by a combination of the growth in the market, my personal passion for developing, non-polluting renewable energy, and it's just a really intellectually exciting place to be. So lots of reasons.
I agree. Yeah. Very cool. So to help set the stage for our discussion, I decided to do a little research into the renewable energy potential of the United States. I personally wanted to understand if our current supply of renewables would meet our energy needs. And what I found, Michael, actually blew my mind. You might already be aware of this, but what I found is, according to research conducted by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and the Department of Energy, the quantity of renewable energy resources available in the United States is more than 100 times that of our nation's annual electricity needs. Like, that is insane. So this basically tells us that there is hypothetically enough clean energy sources right now to meet our needs and then some. So this was crazy, right? Like, we have all these resources available to us, and I was curious to know how many of them we had tapped into. You know, I see solar and wind farms going up every day in Wisconsin and around the country. So I looked into this as well, and I found that out of this huge potential, the U.S. has only tapped into 0.2% of the total renewable energy sources available in the country. So we haven't even harnessed even like 1/10 of this at this time. So it's very interesting. I know that harnessing this will take a lot of infrastructure development and some shifts in the market, but it's great to know we have so much potential here that will help secure a clean energy future for the country.
Yeah, it really is quite amazing. And but if you think about it, you can sort of see where it comes from. People have been using hydropower for years. That's a significant part of the energy mix. But what you've seen in the last, well, since I've been practicing, and even in the last 10 years, you've seen an explosion of renewable energy development. And it's for a bunch of reasons. People are understandably concerned about climate change, about pollution that comes from fossil fuel generation, and the price of renewable energy has come way down. Plus, this country has a very strong, well, the whole world has a very strong appetite for data, for artificial intelligence, for electric vehicles, for other things. So we all need energy, and it's not as if any one sector of the economy, sector of the renewable energy or the energy industry as a whole can just take care of that. But if you think about the resources, I mentioned hydropower, solar, just to use a little fact, rooftop solar has grown by 10 times, 1,000% from like 2012 to 2022.
Wow.
So you have a lot of resources. You have buildings with rooftops, small and large. You have open lands that have wind resources. You have land which is suitable for solar generation, and not just in the Southwest, but all across the country. And you have even things like geothermal resources, which can be used to heat and cool buildings like the schools in Sun Prairie, but also underground, different type of geothermal resources with heat deep in the earth that can be used to create steam and generate electricity. So there's a lot there, but as you alluded to, it doesn't just show up by itself.
Right.
It takes a lot of money and a lot of time to develop it, which doesn't make it any different than the fossil fuel industry, which started more than 100 years ago. It takes time for things to be built.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I want to talk a bit more about that development piece. So when we are considering, building a solar array, maybe on a roof, maybe a very large-scale utility array, or developing a wind farm, what factors are typically considered before that project even begins?
Yeah. Well, I think if you think about who's building the projects, they're being done by developers. I mean, they have their customers, and the customers could be someone who wants to have solar on their own roof, or it could be a utility that wants to be powered by renewable energy. But the people who are actually building the projects, they look at it from the same standpoint that someone who might be building a commercial office building or something. They look at whether there's a market, whether there's a demand for the load, and then they look at where's the optimal place to site it, basically to make money. And that can be in a combination of things. That could be a combination of, it could be, one factor would be geography and the resource. It can also be things like proximity to the transmission grid. It can be economics as to the cost of various energy sources relative to one another. And then policy. Policy plays an important part too. I'm a lawyer that I don't make policy, but I help people work with the policies that have been created. And there are incentives in different states and some at the federal level now that spur the development.
Okay. Yeah, that all makes sense. So there's so many factors that go into this. It's not just economics.
Right.
I want to talk a bit more about large-scale solar and wind farms, maybe utility scale. And in particular, what role will these play or are they currently playing in our nation's clean energy production? I know a lot of times we focus on, I'm a homeowner, I want to put solar on my rooftop, offset
Right.
my energy, but these big systems I feel are really critical to the future of clean energy.
Right. Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And I actually did a little bit of looking up of figures this morning. And what I would say is I'm going to throw out a few figures, but I would strongly encourage your listeners to do their own research, to get familiar, look at credible online and other sources. But just a couple of figures that may put some perspective on this. About 70% of the solar power in the country these days, maybe 75%, comes from what they call utility scale solar, the large solar farms that you see the acres and acres of panels. And that's important. And it's important because it has efficiencies of scale, you can lower the cost, and on top of that, you can not just serve the local area, but you can put it into the wholesale power market and not just help your local area or make a profit by selling to your local area, but also sell in the broader energy market. And it's not just the renewable energy market. Your appliance doesn't care where the electrons come from. They can come from fossil fuel, they can come from hydropower. So all of the sources, there's a wholesale market and they all bid into that. And then you have people with, let's say, rooftop solar. And it could be a school, it could be a residence, it could be a business. And on a building-to-building basis, that can be tremendously helpful because you can reduce your electric bill. You can use it combined with storage to power your electric vehicle, and also have some independence should the grid go out. So there are a variety of different types of generation, but in terms of the bulk of it and the greatest bang for the buck, that would come from the large solar and wind farms.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. On that topic, I wanted to discuss a common misconception around our clean energy future. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of people who think that fossil fuels will be phased out completely and mm-hmm. we will shift fully to relying on renewable sources. I also hear this misconception when it comes to vehicles. So people are concerned that there's going to be a ban on internal combustion engine vehicles and we will do a full switch to electric vehicles, just like a, one and done, we now only drive EVs. And that's typically not the case. Like I said, it's often a misconception for both the energy space and the vehicle space. So I was wondering if you could shed some light on this and really highlight the importance of having a diverse energy portfolio and what role fossil fuels could play in that.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. If you were looking way into the future, like 100 years, maybe longer, it would be possible for the country to be powered entirely by renewable electricity. And as you noted, the resources are out there. Mm-hmm. But things don't happen overnight. And there are different benefits from different types of generation. And I should add here, I'm very pro renewables. I'll just wear my heart on my sleeve. That's what I'm passionate about. That's where I work. But even I can see that you want to use and blend your resources wisely. So what's in the immediate future, I think ideally you would have everything, I guess a menu of everything, but try to use the resources wisely. So I guess I'll have to go a little bit on a walk down a path here. But renewable energy right now is what they call an intermittent resource. And you can generate electricity from solar when the sun is shining. You can generate wind when the wind is blowing. And that doesn't mean that's all they can do. They're useful at other times. What you can do is you can bolster them and firm them up by either installing batteries or other types of storage that capture the excess electricity generated when it's not needed. And then you can dispatch, release energy from those batteries later and extend the time that electricity can be generated from that source. You can also match them with natural gas-fired fueled facilities. And one of the benefits of natural gas plants is you can sort of turn up the power and turn it back down fairly quickly. And so you can, analogous to with the batteries, when the wind isn't blowing or the sun is shining, you could use the natural gas in tandem with the renewable power. And between the two, you have it could be a 24/7 dispatchable energy resource. So they're complementary.
Yeah.
I mean, there are benefits to renewable energy that are going to be there that aren't there for fossil fuels, and one is there is the benefit of them being, at least in terms of the power generation, non-polluting. The other one is the fuel's free. Mm-hmm. That's huge, and a third one is the fossil fuel resources in this country, while they're abundant, they're finite. When I was working for the city in the late 90s, we were talking actively about what's referred to as peak oil, meaning that based on production figures and figures of oil reserves going back to studies in the 1950s, it looked like in the not too distant future we were going to reach peak production, and then the pumping and the ability to extract fossil fuels was going to decline, and we'd be on a slow decline to nothing. Over time, not immediately, but we had reached the peak. And what's happened is two things have stretched out that peak. The first one is the advent of fracking, so people can get access to fossil fuels they couldn't reach before. And the second one, coincidentally, is renewable energy. If you're fueling the country with more from renewable electricity with a free fuel, you're stretching out the time you have before you tap and exhaust what's ultimately a finite supply of fossil fuel. So, it's I don't want to say it's straightforward and simple. It gets pretty complicated, but there are ways to optimize, a state, a country's resources by using them wisely together.
Yeah. I really like how they're being viewed complementary, not one or the other. I think that's key. And I think we're kind of viewing in the future fossil fuels as serving as kind of that backup piece, similar to how we'll have storage for backup too.
I mean, I think so. If you look at where the country's energy is coming from, coal used to be, if not the dominant source, the second biggest source. Coal plants have been, there are very few coal plants being built. And that's not just because of climate change. It's partly because of that, but it's also economics. It's also other environmental issues and cost. And so you're seeing coal has shrunk as a share of the energy pie in the United States. Renewable energy is in the ascendancy. It's gone from I think it's maybe roughly 22% of U.S. resources. Natural gas has increased because of its utility and its flexibility. Right. But it also pollutes, and one of the sources that will likely be a bigger player in the future is nuclear. Mm-hmm. Nuclear, there's a lot of controversy about nuclear, but believe it or not, it's clean energy in the sense of not creating air emissions. Mm-hmm. And actually, I don't know if we're going to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, but the federal incentives starting this year, they don't just apply to renewable energy, they apply to clean energy, and that includes nuclear. So there will be additional, assuming the act stays in place, there will be additional federal support for developing nuclear.
Okay, that's super interesting. And is that under Credit 48E where the nuclear comes in?
Yes, that was okay. That was very good. I'm very impressed. That even some lawyers don't know that. That. Yeah. Well, just to explain what we're talking about here. There are two types of credits that you can get at the federal level to help you finance a energy generation project. One is the investment tax credit, where you get a credit you can take to reduce your taxable income equal to a percentage of the cost of the energy plant. And then the other one's known as the production tax credit, in which you get a credit based on the kilowatt hours of electricity you generate from that source. Starting in January 1st, 2025, the law switched from what they called ordinary production tax credits and investment tax credits, which were technology specific. Starting 2025, they're not technology based, they're carbon neutrality based. So nuclear is going to be a big benefit. Well, it already is, but it will continue to be a big beneficiary of that. Yeah.
And it's now incentivized.
It's incentivized.
For sure.
Yeah, and there are different incentives, and it would take several episodes to talk about them, but there are incentives for manufacturing. But as far as the part of the world I work in, the development and the construction, the incentives can be, they're either a per kilowatt hour generated, that's the production tax credit, but for the investment tax credit, it can be 30% or more of the cost of a project.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't have any numbers in front of me, but I know we've just seen such a huge boom in clean energy developments just in the past 2 years of having the Inflation Reduction Act. I know here in Sun Prairie, we have plans, and we're currently working on doubling our municipal solar production between 2024 and 2026, just because there's now tax credits available. So the incentive has really been benefiting everyone in this space.
It has, and when you mention the city, I mean, there's a special flavor, I guess, of the incentives and what's known as the elective pay or direct pay or refundable tax credit. Until the Inflation Reduction Act was passed in 2022, really it was only the private sector who could benefit from incentives. And it sort of makes sense because you have tax-exempt entities, that run our schools, churches, lots of organizations. And but they were essentially shut out. They would have to partner with a for-profit entity who could claim the tax credit, or alternatively, they could build it themselves, but it would be more expensive.
Yeah.
It was an unequal playing field. So the Inflation Reduction Act gives them a way to get the economic equivalent of a tax credit in terms of actually a check to refund reimburse them for part of the cost of a solar project. So it's so as you mentioned, for nonprofit organizations, schools, hospitals, things like that. Yeah, the development has absolutely exploded. I would say based on my law practice, anecdotally, it wasn't all of this stuff just started with the Inflation Reduction Act. Although when it comes to tax-exempt entities, it got a planetary orbit better. But I would say around 2017, that was when suddenly I had more work than I could do with it, and that's I think when the economics kind of came down.
Yeah.
To put solar and wind on par with the other generation sources.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do want to revisit the Inflation Reduction Act in a little bit, just to talk about what could be happening with it with the new federal administration. But before jumping into that, I wanted to chat with you about what it would take to bring a large-scale solar farm to life. We talked about factors that are considered, but I know there's a lot that goes into this. I previously worked for a large-scale solar and wind design company, so I do know the huge process behind getting these systems, designed, built, permitted, up and running. But if you could maybe dive a bit deeper into, walking me through what we have to consider pre-construction, during construction, post-construction, and what all goes into that process.
No, and now we're going to need a couple more hours. No, I'm just kidding. But you've touched on two of my pet issues. And this is something where I'm a little bit of an evangelist even with my fellow attorneys, because I want them to think more broadly about the big picture. So the way I organize it in my own mind, and I do a lot of mentoring of attorneys and non-attorneys, but the way I try to explain it is two metaphors. The first one is the energy ecosystem, the renewable energy ecosystem. And turning to developing a large solar project, I would be sitting in a client's offices around this big table, and it would be like the size of the Knights of the Round table. And I would think of them as Fellowship of the Ring projects because, again, for people who've read the Lord of the Rings trilogy or watched the movies, you have different people coming together for a common cause. So you have lawyers, you have engineers, you have community relations managers. But if you step back from that conference table, it even gets broader. You have people who finance these projects either through loans, so you have banking institutions, or investors, venture capitalists, investment funds. You have people who are out there. Well, let me go to the other metaphor. The other metaphor that I use is I talk about renewable energy projects being a special flavor of real estate project. And it's not a perfect comparison, but if you put them side by side in parallel, you can see some common things. So if I wanted to build a building on Main Street from the ground up, what would I do? Well, we talked about the money part, getting someone who's going to finance it. You're not going to get anywhere without the money. Then you need what people refer to as site control. So in the case of the building on Main Street, where I wanted to build, let's say, an office building, what was, formerly just an empty lot, I'd have to get ownership or control, maybe not ownership, but control of the real estate. And in the large solar and wind project arena, what people do, because there are a lot of things that can upset a project from when it starts and get in the way of it being completed, they don't want to spend all their money up front. So they don't buy the land. What they do is they get options to buy the land or even more frequently options and to lease the land. So they want to get control, so site control. So you have people involved there. You have not just the developers. Now you've brought in the landowners. Many of those landowners are farmers. And so that's one aspect. Then you have to get together. So going back to your, a block on Main Street, my block on Main Street analogy, if you're going to build a building, you need the construction materials, you need the labor. I mean, you go out and you find the contractors to do that. Same thing in the renewable energy arena. You have to procure equipment and other materials. You have to obtain the labor necessary, the skills, and some of these can be in short supply. Some of the skilled trades. So you have to go out and get what you need to build your project, and that's where things get really, really interesting. And I'm using interesting in sort of that way where it means both intellectually challenging, but it can also mean may you live in interesting times, because that's where suddenly I think I'm working on a renewable energy contract, and I realize that my modest little construction contract, is bringing in issues from all around the world. Supply chain issues, because the parts aren't all made in the USA. In fact, the vast majority of them, at least for the time being, are made overseas.
Right.
Solar panels, and other components as well. And then, so you have supply chain issues, and that brings in nations. And you even have human rights issues. There are a lot of the polysilicon and stop me if I'm going too far afield, but I'll keep going until you pull me back in. But there is a statute, and it was a bipartisan law passed by the Congress several years ago, nearly unanimous votes, something almost unheard of in the U.S. now, called the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. And that's because in Xinjiang province, which is one of the larger provinces in China, where about 40% of polysilicon, which is raw material for solar panels, was coming from, there was credible information to indicate that the Uyghur minority, which is an Arabic minority, ethnic minority in China, was being actually impressed into forced labor in factories for silicon. This was unacceptable to the U.S. from a human rights standpoint. And so there is a very strong law that makes sure that importers, if they're going to bring in materials that are sourced with components overseas, that they're not sourced from forced labor. And so I've actually been involved in projects where panels were impounded for a lengthy period of time while the importer had to come up with the paperwork and satisfy U.S. customs that the panels didn't have components that were built with forced labor. So I'm writing my contract on Main Street in Sun Prairie, and suddenly the world is at my doorstep.
Right.
You also have, and probably a lot of your listeners are hearing the word tariff used a lot these days. Tariffs are not new to the present administration. They go back a long way. I mean, they go back to the start of this country. But when you have an international trade war going on, it adds an element of price variability and unpredictability and even inability to source certain materials that complicates things. So that's construction and procurement. Now, what's different maybe from the building on Main Street is you have to go through different permitting that you wouldn't be associated with building something on Main Street. You're going to be going in there and looking at the land to see if there are wetlands, because you can't build in the wetlands. You're going to be looking for endangered species. You don't do a lot of endangered species, review if you're down the street from Culver's. But you, well, I could make a joke about, the cows, but I'm just kidding. But they're not endangered. But you do, but you do have to do this. And actually one that's current right now in Wisconsin is relating to wind farms. Is the Department of Natural Resources is reviewing its rules on protecting bat species. Mm-hmm. The prairie chicken is another one. There's a gigantic solar plant that is tentatively approved, but people have raised concerns about it encroaching on the habitat. So you have a lot of things that aren't part of your normal commercial development. Then you build. Now the projects are built, and the question is, well, who's going to own them? What are they going to do with them? And this can vary from state to state based on the policy. Mm-hmm. In Wisconsin, the rate-making process and the way the utilities make money and can control their assets favors them owning the projects outright rather than letting someone else own them and buying the power.
Right, which would be like community solar in a sense.
It could be community solar. It could also be, this is going back to the ecosystem. So some of the animals in the ecosystem, community solar would be one of them. And generally speaking, community solar is an opportunity for, maybe ordinary citizens to own a part of a solar project, almost like a share of it, and be able to invest in it and actually own some of the output. Wisconsin currently is not a friendly state for community solar. Other states like Illinois are much more friendly for it. And that's why, you keep coming back to the frame that policy matters. So, yeah, community solar is a significant and growing part of the mix. Mm-hmm. And that gives ordinary people and small businesses and things like that the opportunity, or school districts and municipalities. And there's some of that actually in Dane County, the ability to share in the output of a facility. But you also have the utilities, we call it utility scale solar for a reason. It's big enough to serve the needs of the utility. Another, creature in the ecosystem, to follow the metaphor, would be independent power producers. Those are people who own generation, they generate power from it, and they sell it at wholesale. In Wisconsin, wholesale means you're selling it to a utility, so you're selling it for resale, wholesale. Just like if you were a wholesaler of goods to a supermarket or something like that, a distributor. So there are people literally in Wisconsin who are building plants, solar farms, wind farms, and they're selling the completed facility to utilities who then use them to generate power that goes into their power portfolio, the mix that they use to serve their customers.
Right.
And they may also have, if they have excess power and it's economically advantageous, they may sell some of that power into the wholesale power markets where it could be used, far away from Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. But you will also have people who, they make their living from owning the power plants, kind of holding them like in an investment portfolio, and then they enter into long-term contracts with utilities, sometimes businesses. Other things could be Microsoft, Facebook, people who have Amazon, people who have large data centers, mm-hmm. and they sell the power, and their business model is the developer holds on to the assets and makes the money from the power sales. Other people, they'll build to sell the project. So that's not everything, but that's kind of a cross section. So if I'm working on a solar project and, in my little world as an attorney, and I have to be humble about this because it's not just me. It's not even close to just me. I could spend 1,000 hours working on a project and think that I was pretty important. And maybe in a teeny tiny way I am. But then I remember looking at one of the solar projects I was working on, and I it was like mid-project construction, and they had the number of human hours that people had been paid for. Well, it was up to like 44 human lifetimes, as if
Oh
somebody
my
was
gosh.
as if somebody was working like 24/7.
That's crazy.
There are a lot of jobs out there, and it might not be that different if you're building a ballpark or something like that. I mean,
Yeah.
just so you just a lot of people get brought into the process, and so you have these various people in the ecosystem. You have professionals. Engineers are hugely important. They're designing the project. They're calculating the output. People are modeling. You have environmental professionals. You have accountants. You have consultants. You have construction workers, electricians. I mean, people driving the earth-moving equipment, all kinds of things. And then when everything's built, you have, there in the real estate industry, for commercial real estate, using my example of the building on Main Street, you'll have property management companies. And their analog in the renewable energy industry is you have firms that provide operation and maintenance services. And that's important. And these people will make sure that the projects are operating, they're maintained, and they'll get paid on a yearly basis to do that. So
Are these also the people who would maybe mow the lawn underneath a solar array, or are we talking bigger maintenance in terms of the infrastructure?
Well, that's a great question. When you mentioned mow the lawn, now you got me thinking about agrivoltaics and
yeah.
sheep and prairie plants and things like that.
Right.
And that's probably worth spending a little bit of time on that, but that could also be an entire show.
Yeah.
In terms of the maintenance, I mean, if it snows, you'll want to clear the snow off. I mean, a lot of times it'll just melt off, but and things like that. But also there are parts of the equipment, they break down.
Right.
Panels tend to have warranty. I'm sort of inferring this from the warranties you get. So solar panels may have a 30-year warranty.
Yeah.
And inverters, which this is where I could bring into the whole subject of alternating current versus direct current. But let's just say, for the sake of this question, they're important. And they have much shorter warranties. They break down more quickly. So people need to be monitoring that. And then another thing that can happen is, over time, one of the reasons the cost of renewable energy has declined is because they come up with more efficient components. They do a better job of converting sunlight to electricity. So if you have let's say you have a 30-year lease on some land to host a solar farm, it may be that 10 years in, there's a much more efficient component or piece of equipment. And you can swap that out. Not quite as simple as Legos, but not that complicated either. And you can actually improve the output of your plant. So people are keeping an eye on all of those things.
Okay.
Since we were talking about the fact that I work in fossil fuel plants too, operation and maintenance of solar and wind resources is much, much less complicated than operation and maintenance of fossil fuel generation stations. There are just you need a lot more maintenance. There's a lot more equipment. It can break down more easily.
Yeah, I can see that.
So.
Okay. Wow. Well, this is super interesting. Thank you for laying out just everything that goes into these projects.
Yeah.
For anyone who was just thinking about why it takes many years to bring these large-scale projects to life, now you know why. There's a lot of hoops to jump through, a lot of considerations that are made, a lot of potential barriers that could be brought up to these projects.
Yeah.
So thanks for walking us through that.
Oh, you're welcome.
If it's okay with you, I did want to move into revisiting the Inflation Reduction Act and kind of the new federal administration. So as many of our listeners may be aware, our new federal administration has made some abrupt policy changes that will no doubt impact our energy future. I've seen everything from declaring a national energy emergency and promising to ramp up oil drilling efforts to limiting our regulatory agencies and targeting offshore wind in particular.
Right.
How do you anticipate these policy changes impacting both clean energy and fossil fuels?
That is a really important question, and I'm not trying to avoid it, but I'm trying to say there's a lot of unpredictability right now. So maybe I should just talk about the things I have some personal exposure to.
Sure.
When it comes to what's best for the country, you have and best for developing the right resources, you have this interplay of geography, economics, and policy. But when someone makes a blanket statement, and I'm going to pick on one that's been in the media, drill baby drill, that's not a policy, that's a slogan. And it's very quickly, and you probably see this in the newspaper already, it's not even something that the oil companies favor. It runs into economic reality that we are in global energy markets. So I'm not going to claim to be an oil energy expert, but if you think about this, you have a finite resource, so let's produce more of it. Well, what happens if you produce more of it and you're in a global market? Well, you drive down the price, meaning the people who are in the business of producing it and selling it are going to make less money, which means they're going to be less inclined to drill baby drill. They're going to drill baby less. And so I don't know what's going to happen. As far as things that actually have been done that are affecting my corner of the world, day one in office, the president signed an executive order relating to wind. And on its title, it seemed to be aimed entirely at offshore wind, which the president has a long historic opposition to. I'm not sure if it's anything more than aesthetic, but because of a lot of the things that are said. And I encourage people, since, I'm to do their own research, and not just rely on politics from one side of the aisle or the other. But when it comes to wind industry, the order actually goes further than offshore wind. It also goes to permits for people to locate wind on federal lands. Federal lands are being opened up to drilling. They're being shut down to wind. But it even goes further than that. I'm aware of projects now that would potentially be built in the state of Wisconsin that are already on the drawing board, would invest more than $1 billion into the state of Wisconsin, create hundreds of jobs. They're on private land. Their approval is governed by state law, but one of the things in that executive order is a very broad sentence, and I can't quote it from memory, but it basically says, while the current administration is doing a wholesale review of permitting processes, that no federal agency, meaning any of them, Army Corps of Engineers, Endangered Species Review, or anything like that, should issue any permit, approval, right-of-way relating to offshore and onshore wind. So it's I can't say I know of any projects that have been killed yet, but what I'm seeing immediately in my practice is people are rewriting the contracts because suddenly there's a whole new risk variable, which is, am I going to have a project that's otherwise great but is going to be delayed? Probably delayed is the immediate thing, because we have a federal government that's decided to stop reviewing or cooperating with the reviews for endangered species. And that's a big question mark right now. And I can imagine that if I'm in Congress or even in the executive branch, I'm probably being inundated with people from all different areas telling me what they think is right.
Right.
So,
Yeah, in my world, we were a little bit worried about the Inflation Reduction Act. Could you share a bit more about that and how this could possibly be impacted?
Yeah, the Inflation Reduction Act is a very broad, really landscaping changing bill, not just for energy, but other things as well. In fact, it does many things. It probably doesn't reduce inflation, but that's, packaging in getting legislation passed. But it does very importantly affect the clean energy industry by providing incentives. And what's been talked about now are whether those incentives should be continued. And it's actually a very complicated political landscape as well as economic landscape. So, for example, if someone took aim at the direct pay tax credits, that could hamstring the city of Sun Prairie.
Yep.
It could hamstring the Sun Prairie Area School District. It could hamstring churches. It could hamstring lots of other people who wanted to be powered by solar, take control of their own community's destiny. If other parts on electric vehicles are I guess if incentives are phased out, it's going to affect car makers. And you have a complicated mix there. You have a very well-known, very rich car maker who's working closely with the administration right now on trying to come up with efficiencies in government agencies. You have the president of Ford saying that the tariffs and other changes coming from the administration are going to wreak havoc on the auto industry and the American auto industry. And you have a lot of opinions. So if you look at the playing field right now, the Inflation Reduction Act had multiple aims. I mean, it even affects drug price negotiations. But relating to clean energy, it had several goals. One was to spur the development of renewable energy, clean energy broader, including nuclear. Another one was to bring manufacturing back to the United States, which it has actually been very effective in doing. There have been billions in dollars of plants to build various components, batteries, panels, other things, announced in just 2 years. I mean, an enormous amount of money has come in to build U.S. manufacturing. And you have growth in solar farms. You know, I was telling the story a little while ago about even partway through one of Wisconsin's solar farms, you had 44 years of human labor and rising. And the Inflation Reduction Act, so it's a manufacturing support bill, it's a clean energy support bill, it's a jobs creation bill, and a good wage creation bill. And what that means is if you're going to get the full tax incentive, if you're building a large solar farm, a large wind farm, or in the future a nuclear plant, you have to pay people prevailing wage. And you can't just go out and source the cheapest labor. Go to the state in the country or the country in the world that has the cheapest labor and bring people in and build it as cheaply as possible. It also requires, if you're going to get the maximum incentive, that you train apprentices and use apprentices to provide 15% of the labor hours on your work. So you have all these things going on, and I don't know if there are losers, but the winners are the people who get the projects. I suppose arguably the losers are, you could say, it's increasing the budget deficit or something like that. But right now, if someone, meaning the current administration or anybody, wants to change the Inflation Reduction Act, first you have a separation of powers issue. It's the law of the land passed by the Congress, signed into law by the president. You can't unilaterally have the executive branch, reverse it. That needs to be an act of Congress. But what you can do is you can have the agencies who are dispersing the money kind of clog up the pipes by delaying action on things, and some of the things that are actually happening right now. And you and your listeners are probably hearing enough stories about people losing jobs, not getting anticipated checks to fund. So I won't throw in more of them. But to complicate things now, going into the political realm, the majority of the money from the Inflation Reduction Act has gone to what people refer to as red states. So they're getting a lot of economic development, they're getting a lot of money, and so you have a quandary where people whose senators and most of their representatives voted against this legislation, they're the ones who are benefiting most handsomely from it. So what do you do now? Yeah. That's always the question, whether it's renewable energy or life. What next? And so, it's anybody's guess.
It is, yeah. And you really touched on all of the broad impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act, the job creation, bringing domestic production to the U.S. for these clean energy components, and just how attempting to defund this will really have drastic negative impacts on the economy.
I think so. And I think one of the challenges is, I understand that there are larger goals, and I understand when people are divided on an issue, there's usually something on both sides of the issue. It's not usually somebody's all right and somebody's all wrong.
Yeah.
But if you're in the business community and you're trying to plan your future and you're trying to plan your business, and whether it's fossil fuel or renewable energy, these are multi-year projects. And one of the things that was transformative about the Inflation Reduction Act was, whether you agree with the path or not, it created a 10-year plus path.
Yep.
That is not something in my lifetime or in my work lifetime that the United States has had in the energy industry. whether it was perfect energy policy or not so perfect, we had a policy. So when you start changing it like turning it on a dime, you create uncertainty, and then that ripples down. And you know who benefits most from that? Lawyers. Because we rewrite the contracts. We have upset clients saying, what do we do about this? What do we do about that? I would just soon not make my money that way. I'd rather have people working together towards a common goal.
Yeah.
But, we'll just have to see. I mean, what I might say or what somebody else might say in a moment of passion about a particular issue is going to run into reality when you take it into the country as a whole. And even more, we live in a global world now with global energy markets.
Exactly.
So we'll see. There are forces bigger than any one person out there operating on all of us.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Good way to look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll say just from our perspective, the fact that this was a 10-year act, our city has made plans through 2032 to install more solar, more geothermal, purchase more microgrids, more batteries. Now we're questioning if we can do that, because if we aren't eligible for elective pay, or I guess if there's no longer elective pay for us, then those would have to be dollars out of our pockets, and we don't know if we can afford all of that investment in that amount of time without that assistance.
That's right.
So it's tricky.
Yeah, it is. I mean, stepping back from it, I'm optimistic that over the long term, because there are just so many forces in its favor, the free fuel, the need to protect, basically, our health and survival, and avoid displacing people who are affected by climate change. Anytime I use a figure here, I didn't do the original research, but I just saw something the other day saying, there's going to be $1.5 trillion reduction in home value in people who are in areas affected by climate change. Why? Because it's going to be less desirable to own a house there.
Right.
Their insurance rates are going to go skyrocketing. There's some parts of the country that are no longer insurable in the private marketplace because of climate-related risks. I mean, that's the playing field even today.
Right.
So I think it's a complicated world. We have to all get along. But I think in the long term, because even if any one country is going to stop doing something, the imperatives to shift the energy base more to renewable energy for the free fuel, for the reduction of environmental degradation, because it's just cheaper, is going to continue. So as much as any one person may want to try to, and I mean anywhere in the world, not just in the United States, may want to turn that ecosystem to their will, they're going to be dealing with forces larger than themselves.
Very true. Yeah, there's how many countries in the Paris Climate Agreement? Is it 195?
There may well be. I guess there's one less now. But
So, yes, I definitely see what you mean.
Yeah.
I guess on that note of being a bit more optimistic, which I don't want to end this episode on a sad note, so I'm glad you brought that up. Do you just have any final concluding thoughts for the listeners?
I guess speaking on a personal level, this is an area that I find absolutely fascinating. It's intellectually challenging. It's like at the crossroads between science, technology, policy, writing, everything. But I would say I am optimistic. If I remember, starting my law practice back in the 1980s, a lot of the stuff we're talking about now wasn't even on anybody's radar screen. And if you think that renewable energy went from pretty much, apart from hydropower, not being part of the United States energy resources that were developed until now we're between hydropower and the rest of it. It's up to 22%. I think hydropower is like 5 or 6%. It's just been a phenomenal, rapidly evolving area. There are other phenomenal areas like that: artificial intelligence, use of data, and so I think like anything else, we're going to move in directions and also be surprised by some of what we see. But I remain optimistic about it as a whole.
So, I do too. And you're right. There's always things changing every day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed our conversation. I think our listeners did too. And this was just very eye-opening, looking at the future of clean energy in our country and how different sources can complement each other, and also, what the current federal administration is doing and what we can maybe expect from them. So thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're welcome. And it's been a pleasure for me to be here. And I would be remiss if I didn't say Sun Prairie can take considerable pride and positive feeling that it has been absolutely a leader in policy and other things to support renewable energy. Maybe you're too modest to say this, but Sun Prairie was the first community in Wisconsin to get the Soul Smart Platinum designation. I'm in McFarland now. I sit on their sustainability committee. We're only gold. So we admire Sun Prairie. And so anyway, thank you to you and Aaron Oppenheimer and all the great people in the city of Sun Prairie who are making Sun Prairie a leader in clean energy.
Of course, we're happy to do the work.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Sustainable Sun Prairie with your host, Rose Daly. I hope you enjoyed this episode and uncovered something new about sustainability. As always, you can subscribe to our podcast and listen anytime on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and you can listen live on 103.5 FM The Sun, WLSP-LP, and on demand on the Sun Prairie Media Center app. For links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as our contact info, please visit the show notes. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.